Francisco. We're having a retrospective conversation about Momotombo Press.
Indeed.
And the work we're going to discuss spans an inception of 2000 and an actual realization of the year 2001, all the way through to the last publication date
2009.
to 2009. And here we are in 2013 looking back on basically a
I say 10 years.
around 10 years total effort of a press that was born out of our time together at UC Davis.
Momotombo Press, which I should probably start by saying something about the name of the press. Momotombo Press, the name was inspired by the volcano in Nicaragua called Momotombo. And I wanted to infuse a bit of Nicaraguanness into the gesture.
And why is that? I'm throwing you a softball.
Because my parents came to California in the late 50s from Nicaragua, so I'm of Nicaraguan origin.
So Momotombo, the volcano in Nicaragua, became the talisman
Exactly.
and the name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell our audience of the future about what were some of the things that inspired you to start a press in the first place?
I think what would be useful is for us to talk about the context. First of all, how we met and where we were when the press was started. We were both at UC Davis in 98.
Just as young and cute as we are now.
And I think one of the things I often say when asked about what inspired the press is I talk about, even before we talked about what happened at Davis, the experience of being published in the Chicano chapbook series with Gary Soto, which did happen in while I was at UC Davis.
And that was light yogurt, strawberry milk. Was that your chapbook?
Yeah, light yogurt, strawberry milk. Gary, as you may know, was the founder and editor of the Chicano chapbook series, which had two waves, one in the late 70s, which included such people as Sandra Cisneros, Alberto Rios, and others. And then he interrupted the series and restarted it in the late 90s. And in the second wave of the series, he included such writers as Rigoberto Gonzalez, Richard Yanez, myself, John Olivares Espinosa.
So this is late 90s for the most part?
Yeah, yeah. One of the things about and then shortly after he did my chapbook, he stopped. He decided that the gesture had been done. And so there was a vacuum. There was a vacuum. So I think that vacuum, coupled with our small press experiences at UC Davis, is what created the fertile ground to start something, such as when we were in the class with Sandra McPherson. In fact, you can talk. I'd be interested to know about Swanside Press because that was such I think, an important part of the recipient story.
Sure. They have a kind of a twin genesis in a way, Swanside Press and Momotombo Press. And my memories of our time at UC Davis are in both Gary Snyder's classes and Sandra McPherson's classes, they would bring in old boxes just loaded with this material richness, chapbooks from the 70s, from the 60s, from the 80s, chapbook after chapbook that they had been collecting over the years to represent this kind of homegrown yet highly tradition in publishing. And so at one point, Sandra McPherson was my thesis advisor, and she was known to say, I wish I could start a press. Someone should start a press. There are so many good poets out there who are struggling to be published. And so one day I said to her, let's do it. Let's start a press. I said, you get me a graduate assistantship and I'll work for you to launch a press. And so she said, oh, okay. So she secured a one-semester assistantship for me, and we founded Swanside Press, which had a mission to publish exclusively poetry at that time. And
so that was before the prize, before the Swanside.
Yeah, then it launched a poetry chapbook prize.
Which was where we had the class, I think. There was also the class.
Eventually having the press spawned a small press publishing class where graduate students all had a hands-on experience running the contest, selecting the winner.
And I was in that class, remember?
Yes. Meanwhile, as Sandy McPherson and I are forming Swanside, across town, in the mind of Francisco Aragon.
The experience of having my chapbook published with Gary Soto, continuing that story, having the physical chapbook in hand, having something in hand became like a calling card. And I remember that a number of the poems from the chapbook went on to get published in a number of anthologies. In fact, in some ways, I'm actually at this institution because of that chapbook. Because when it was published, it occurred to me to ask if I could give a reading at the conference of the Knox conference in Portland, Oregon, and this Knox being National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies. So it was having that chapbook which landed me a reading at the Knox Conference in Portland,
Oh, no.
which is how I met Gil Cardenas.
Oh, okay. And
Yeah.
Gil Cardenas was the director here
He
at.
was the founding director of the Institute for Latino Studies.
Yeah.
So having that chapbook was really empowering.
Yeah.
And when it shut down, when the Chicano chapbook series shut down, I remember thinking that it would be nice to do that for my peers.
Mhm.
And I think it's important to say at this point that the first iteration of Momotombo Press was not a Latino-centric project.
Mark my words. 5 emerging poets.
And as you can see, the people who were published in the inaugural volume of Momotombo Press were all people who were pursuing MAs at UC Davis.
The Momotombo ended up with a mission to publish Latino poets, and as you say, this first volume, though, didn't necessarily have that emphasis, but you came out of the tradition of the Chicano chapbook series, and I remember when you approached me to be in this edition, I was lucky enough to be one of your 5, and you said, "I've decided I'm publishing 5 poets from the program, and I would like 2 of them to be Latinas." And that was part of your early vision. You were very
I don't remember saying that.
pleased. You were very pleased that you could have a 40% Latina representation in your first volume. And so that would be Angela Garcia is the other poet
I was
who's
just trying to
a
think.
Latina poet.
One of the other things that I remember about the press that sort of distinguished it from the Chicano chapbook series was this idea of having more established writers, the brief introduction.
Yeah.
But I don't remember why I decided to do that.
You had a model, and I don't remember what it was either. You had a model. We had seen somewhere where that had happened.
I think it was Penny Whistle Press.
Oh, okay.
And Francisco Alarcón had published in that press, and I believe that Juan Felipe Herrera may have written. But that would be peer-to-peer, not established.
Yeah, not established as a mentoring gesture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't recall. I think you had a model. I don't remember what it was.
Well, as one of the first authors in the series, do you have any recollections about the process of how that?
I think that you had copies of nearly the entire thesis manuscript for each of those folks, and that you made selections. I don't remember particularly suggesting one poem over another. I think you applied a sense of vision or a sense of unity or extracting something from each poet.
I do recall, now that you mention it, in my introduction, that I basically culled a length manuscript
from each thesis.
From your thesis.
Yeah, that was an interesting effort, and of course, completely gratifying for me to see what other readers responded to, see what you responded to as an editor. Were you trying to distill a representative bit from each one, or did you look for more thematic
there was a
unity?
combination of that, but also, and this is getting back to the context specifically, it wasn't until taking Sandra McPherson's class, which was the occasion for that prize, when they did the Swanside Press Prize, that I began to think of the chapbook as this sort of coherent whole. And I remember that when we were reading and critiquing the contest entries, we would have discussions about manuscripts that had very strong poetry in them, but that somehow
didn't add up,
weren't cohering in a satisfying way.
Right.
And so I think that was part of the thinking that went into choosing the poems that I chose, whether or not leave it up to readers to decide if in fact they cohered in that way. But I remember I was thinking that as a direct result of being in.
So you were seeking a kind of aesthetic unity, or if not unity, maybe that's overstating it, but a kind of aesthetic relationship within each poet's work. A kind of, this would be the Lisa Sperber chapbook-like unit, and this would be the Sean McDonald chapbook-like unit. Yeah.
Maybe we should say, for the sake of the record, that the 5 authors who were in the inaugural volume were Lisa Sperber, Sean McDonald, Angela Garcia, Eric Goodis, and yourself. And I should also mention that Eric Goodis was the person who handled the book design
for that volume.
And I think
I didn't remember that.
Yeah, he did the book design and then the formatting
Oh, interesting.
for this
And
volume.
he was a graduate student with us at the
Yeah.
time.
And I think this might be a good time to talk a little bit about the influence, because I do remember it had an influence of being in Gary Snyder's workshop and what he had to say about small press publishing. And what I took away from his influence was the notion of 2 things: starting small on a modest scale, which might include even self-publishing, and putting that work out for your immediate community,
Yeah.
which might even be just to give away to your friends.
That's right.
Do you remember that? Yeah.
That's true. He did emphasize that sense of cultivating the audience that was literally at hand down the street, the cafes in your neighborhood. And was this a 300 copy or 500 copy
I think it was 500
edition?
copies.
I think
Yeah.
that it was.
And I think I even mentioned, in fact, I think I even mentioned the very, yeah, in the very first sentence, in the spring of 1999, Gary Snyder devoted a session in his poetry workshop in small press publishing, sharing with his students how rip rap first got into print.
Oh,
And so I
yeah.
remember him
Hmm.
using that as an example that here was a rip rap, which was a
Mhm.
tiny small press limited edition run. And it wasn't until later that it had its own lot of sort of trade publishing
Yeah.
iteration.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had forgotten that story of his. I think what I took away from his class was the sense of the poetry world as being really a DIY kind of place, really a do-it-yourself kind of place, and that the role of the poet includes audience cultivation and experiments with the actual material production of work. Some students were taking a bookmaking class at that
Yeah.
time. There was just an atmosphere in our cohort of taking the reins of the entire process of creation and dissemination.
And I think another instrumental experience that also involves Gary was the class. I think you were in that class, the class that we took on the San Francisco Renaissance. And I remember for that class, my semester project was Jack Spicer. And so I read A Poet Be Like God, his
Mm.
biography, and read through all his work. And anyone who's familiar with Jack Spicer's biography knows that all his books were published in a small press, White Rabbit Press, and he
Mm.
insisted that they be published by small local presses. And
Mm.
he was actually very adamant about not being published
Mhm.
in presses that had wide distribution. He
Hmm.
wanted them published in small local presses.
Huh.
So I remember that caused a great impact. The idea of
Yeah.
someone like Jack Spicer's stature wanting to do something really small.
And to stick with it as
Yeah.
his practice.
And there were other things happening concurrently, which I've mentioned in some of the prefaces over the course of the titles. There was the Berkeley poet Jim Powell, who was a graduate student at UC Berkeley when I was an undergrad, and who had won a MacArthur
Mhm.
fellow and fellowship and had published a book with the University of Chicago Press and had published his Sappho translations with Farrar
Mm.
Straus. And then he won the MacArthur. And then he decided to self-publish these chapbooks of
Mhm.
his, which he called them, wrote it down here, Sage, where does it, where,
And pennyroyal?
yeah, Sage and Pennyroyal.
Ah.
And I remember they were very modestly produced,
Ah.
and he would sell them for $15. And his rationale was that that's what it cost to buy a CD of music at that time. And so
Oh, okay.
that was his CD.
Oh,
And I remember being struck by the whole notion that if
great
a
rationale.
MacArthur fellow can self-publish his chapbook and sell it for $15, then why can't we do something like that on a
Yeah.
small scale as well?
Yeah, so this is a little bit off book, off of our cheat sheet here, but I am interested in that relationship between self-publishing and small press publishing as distinct but maybe cousin efforts. And meanwhile, at the time that you're starting your work as an editor and a publisher, you also are continuing to send your own work out. You're pulling together your own next book at that time. So, did you ever feel any tension between those 2 activities? Did you ever think, "If I wasn't doing so much darn editing, I could get more writing done?" Or did you feel they were complementary efforts?
Goes back and forth.
Uh-huh.
I think over time, as I got more and more engaged with the editing and the publishing aspect of the field, which necessarily takes time away from
Right.
cultivating your own art making, I reconciled myself to the notion of that activity was just a complementary or supplementary activity. I remember Eric Goodis made a very flattering remark when we launched Mark My Words, and he brought up the example of James Laughlin
Mm.
at New Directions, and how
Mm.
James Laughlin started New Directions
Yeah.
with money he inherited from his father, and that became a good part of his identity as the
Mhm.
publisher of New Directions. But
Yeah.
then he was also a poet
So
himself.
you found that
So that was sort of
a good
became,
model.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 And in terms of self-publishing or small press publishing, I was engaged with both notions, and I put down on the cheat sheet because I remember Thomas Kinsella in Ireland had Pepper Canister
Mm.
Press,
Hmm.
which would be his own work in book increments
Mhm.
that he would self-publish,
Mhm.
and you can find them in bookstores.
Yeah.
And then eventually they would become, but they'd start off as these self-published
Uh-huh.
chapbooks.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, so they are related efforts. Do you want to talk any more about some of these influences? Otherwise, I have some more. questions.
Sure.
I think that it might be interesting to hear about the actual flow of money and materials in terms of generating these and how that shifted over time with your institutional affiliation changing.
Sure, sure. Yeah, the way Momotomo Press got started, money-wise, was pretty straightforward, and I had no idea what I was doing. But in essence, I put together a proposal, which included writing samples from the five of you,
Hmm.
and the proposal may have been about a page. And I sent that proposal, hard copy, mailed it to, let's call it 30 people who I would describe as family and
Hmm.
friends. And very specific, I described the project and I asked for anywhere between $50 and $300.
Hmm.
And so I actually put a ceiling on it. And from that first gesture, I raised about $6,000.
Wow.
And so that pretty much
Nice.
bankrolled the first two volumes, Mark My Words
Oh, okay. It covered both.
and it covered Mark My Words, and it covered volume two, which was The Land of Give and Take,
Oh, Chris
Christopher Sinton.
Sint. Yeah.
And what I remember about that experience, because it was my first foray into fundraising, two things I remember. One thing is that, which shows how little I knew about fundraising, because in my pitch letter, I said, I'm not going to ask you for money. I'm only going to ask you this one time, which of course,
You
you would,
never would say again in
yeah.
the rest of your fundraising
Yeah.
career. Yeah.
And the second thing that was interesting is that even as I was going down the list of people, I, in my own mind, would have a little guesstimate of how much this person would give,
Uh-huh.
how much this person would give.
Uh-huh.
And I would think, oh, this person's going to give me 300.
Mhm.
This person's going to give me 50.
Mhm.
This person's going to give me 100. And I was correct about 50% of the time.
Mm.
And so there were people who I thought were good for 50 who gave me 300.
How about that?
People who I thought were good for 300 who gave me 50. And
Yeah.
so it was really interesting to see.
Uh-huh.
And one person ignored my ceiling and just gave me 500.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the other thing I remember about that experience, which I did take with me as I began to raise money for other projects, was that there were a number of people who explicitly thanked me for inviting them to
Mhm.
be a part of this
Mm.
project. And so they didn't really view it as me hitting them up for money as much as me
Inviting them.
inviting them to become part of something special,
Yeah.
which is a really good lesson.
It is such an important distinction that the Momotomo supporters can be proud of promoting literature in this way, and as you say, that it's not necessarily a matter of a begging bowl as
Yeah,
it is an invitation. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Should we start moving through the titles? And as
Sure.
we do,
So
you can describe the evolution of your institutional affiliation. You're still at Davis when this one comes out, right?
I'm actually
Or are you in Spain
No, Crystal, we should say something about Christopher Sint. Christopher Sint was a graduate student at UC
in
Davis
literature?
in literature, though I think he had done the MA and then he
That's right.
went
He
into
had
the
stayed
PhD
on. Yep.
program. And the interesting thing about him is that I think shortly after his book came out, he went to St. Mary's, and I'll tell you why that's important in a minute. But actually, I think Chris' book came out shortly after I got to Notre Dame to start my MA,
Oh, okay.
which would have been the fall of 2001.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And now I should say that just to give credit where credit is due, his book was designed and formatted by Lisa Gonzalez, who
No
went on
kidding.
to become a Momotoba Press author
Uh-huh.
after it became Latino centric.
Right.
And just for the sake of documentation, I think we should also just mention we should probably say
Who
who.
introduced each one? That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were introduced by
Gary
Gary
Snyder,
Snyder,
my mentor, one of my mentors.
and Sean McDonough was introduced by Bruce Weigel. Eric Goodis was introduced by Jack Marshall. Lisa Sperber was introduced by Alan Williamson. And Angela Garcia was introduced by Robert Vasquez. And of course, that's significant because Robert was the inaugural judge of the Andres Montoya Poetry
Hmm.
Prize.
And only two of those are on the faculty at UC Davis. So you pulled from poets all throughout California, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And Christopher's chapbook was introduced by Brenda Hillman, blurbed by Michael Palmer and Jane Hirschfield.
Mm.
I remember him telling me when he found out that I landed the two blurbs with Jane Hirschfield and Michael Palmer, and when Brenda Hillman had said yes, he goes, I can die now.
Yeah, that would be California poetry nirvana.
The reason why I bring up Christopher Sitton, how important he was, is because shortly after that book came out, he began teaching at St. Mary's College in Moraga. And I knew that in order to sustain the press, and at least in the beginning, I thought at some point I'd like to have access to grant money.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, I would need an institutional affiliation. And so what
Oh,
happened was that
it
Momotomo
was
Press,
housed there,
for a
wasn't it?
brief period of
Yeah.
time, was officially housed at St. Mary's
I
College in
forgot about that
Moraga.
phase. That's right. In
Yeah.
Kristen's office, essentially, right?
By having it housed there, when I began to fundraise for subsequent titles, checks would be made out to St. Mary's
Uh-huh.
College. And so
Uh-huh.
he set up an account for
To be a
us.
fiscal agent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the titles that were published during that iteration would include our other Davis colleague, Wednesday Carlton.
Who was she living in France when that one came out?
I think she may have already moved to
But she
France at that
graduated
time.
with us from
Yeah,
UC Davis. Yeah.
yeah. And then Kathy Garlick, The Listening World, with a wonderful introduction by Adam Zakayevsky. Adam Zakayevsky introduced her book. She was a student at Houston, and she was a friend of Eric Goodis, and she was trying to get work published, and she
Oh,
wasn't getting it.
interesting.
So this title was curated by Eric
Oh,
and also
interesting.
designed by Eric.
Huh.
And Wednesday's chapbook was introduced by Alan Williamson. And the last title, while the press was still housed at St. Mary, was the first Latino title.
Oh, okay, Steven. Where at that point, you still didn't necessarily have an all Latino emphasis. It just happened that this was your. So let's look at the full array of Momotombo 1.0.
Yeah.
Free Latino emphasis,
Yes.
in which there happens to be two and one Latino, Steven Cordova. And this, what year did his come out?
Let's check.
That was, yeah.
2003.
Oh, 10 years ago. Okay, then you come here.
I was actually no, I actually came here in 2001. So I'm
This
actually
is actually during your years as a graduate
yeah,
student. You're
in
continuing with
essence,
this,
yeah, in essence.
continuing with this
And
press. And
so
where's the money coming from?
the money is still coming from small fundraising,
Uh-huh.
but checks are being made out to St. Mary's College.
Oh, okay.
Checks are
At
being
that
out to
time.
St. Mary's
Okay.
College. And then it was after Stephen's chapbook came out, 2003 is a key year because that's the year that I began working. And so at that point, I realized that I had to create a literary program here. I had this press, which was going to be Latino centric,
Yeah.
starting with Stephen, but it was housed at St. Mary's. And I thought, no, I need to bring the press to Notre Dame.
So was your decision to convert it to a Latino-centric press, was that part of getting hired at Institute for Latino Studies?
No.
Or that was a decision that kind of you settled on after Stephen's book came out,
I
but
was
before you started working for ILS?
Yeah, I was hired in July of 2003, right after I completed my MFA here.
Uh-huh.
There was no
Okay.
literary component to speak of at the institute, and so I was charged in essence with creating one. And one of the first things we did was the Andres Montero Poetry Prize. But then after Stephen's chapbook came out, then I realized, okay, the way I thought of it was, at that time, Momotombo Press was a hobby. So the idea was to convert that hobby into part of my job,
Yeah, to integrate these parts of your
And
life.
so that meant to bring the press to Notre Dame. And so two things had to happen. One, I had to pitch the idea to my immediate supervisor at the time, and then we jointly had to pitch the idea to Gil Cárdenas, and then he had to sign off on that. That was the first thing that had to happen. The second thing that had to happen, which is actually a real key thing, is that I had to figure out a way to fiscally house the press here. And so I managed, and to this day, I don't remember exactly how I managed, but I managed to speak to someone in development who agreed to create an account for Momotombo Press.
okay.
That was the excuse to create an account in development where checks would be made out to Notre Dame was specifically for the press.
Wow.
But then as Letras Latinas began to grow, that account became a Letras Latinas.
Oh, okay. Okay. And you ended up
Fundraising for
into that account
Yeah.
for your public programming, your programming in schools.
So
your
Momotombo
speakers.
Press allowed me to create an account with the development. And so
Right.
whenever I'd get checks, I'd walk them over to Donna Snyder and she would deposit them.
Huh.
So Momotombo Press, in essence, allowed Latinas to become a fiscal entity in many respects.
Right. And Letras Latinas today is the literary division of ILS that includes the chapbooks, book prizes.
When Momotombo Press was still up and running, it included it included the press, it included the book prizes, it included
lots of public programming.
Poetas, it included
Yes, our collaboration with St. Mary's.
So once I decided to bring the press to Notre Dame, then of course the next question became who will be the next. And this actually brings up an interesting discussion when we start talking about this book.
Oh, right.
So
yeah.
Lisa Gonzalez, as you recall, was our colleague UC Davis. It's interesting how these Davis connections continue.
Yeah.
And shortly after I began working here, Lisa Gonzalez enrolled in the creative writing program here at Notre Dame.
About 2003,
I'm gonna say
maybe 2002.
no,
You were
because
saying
we were here. I was already working at the
okay,
ILS. So let's see. When this came out, she was a student here. So this came out in 2000.
okay,
So she may have been in her first year here, and I was already working here for a year.
okay,
But the interesting thing about this chapbook is that I remember I was always a big admirer of Lisa's work, but it never occurred to me that she would consider herself a Latina writer. And one time we were having a conversation and she just brought it up and she said, well, couldn't I publish a Momotombo Press?
Yes, she did.
And I said, do you consider yourself a Latina writer? And she said, let's see, I was born and raised in California. The first writer who spoke to me in any substantive way was Sandra Cisneros.
Hmm.
All my best friends were Chicana. I was subjected to the same racial epithets that they were. I come from a big Catholic family. Yes.
And she's ethnically Portuguese, so in California, you wouldn't find a generation or two behind us anyone ethnically Portuguese aligning themselves with Chicanos and
Yeah.
Latino
So
populations.
I actually, when she said that, I thought, yeah, I'd like to push you.
And this is just from what came before in another way, in that it's prose.
Exactly. Yeah, this is our first prose title. And I'm very proud of this chapbook for a couple of reasons. We were able to get a beautiful introduction by Elena
Uh-huh.
Maria Viramontes. And the other thing I'll say about this is that this was designed. One of the things about being at Notre Dame, one of my cohorts here was a Filipino poet named Charles Valley. And while we were here, we started a journal, a student journal here called Danta.
Mm.
You remember
I remember that,
Danta?
yeah, which
So
is Irish for poetry.
he taught himself book design, and so for the next several titles, in fact, Charles Valley became the official designer of Momotombo Press.
Oh, okay. So this was his first design effort, your first prose chapbook,
And look who blurbed Lisa's chapbook.
well-known Portuguese American writer, Catherine
Catherine
Vaz.
Vaz
Uh-huh.
and M. Evelina Galing.
Uh-huh. Evelina Calling, yeah.
And then, of course, once the press was housed at Notre Dame, visually anyway, we had to come up with a new logo. And so the logo is the sunburst, the ILS sunburst with the silhouette of the volcano embedded. So we went from the simple line drawing
That's right.
of the press, of the volcano's silhouette, to the sunburst.
Combining it with the ILS logo. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing I would say is that choosing to publish Lisa brought to the fore this whole question of who's Latino, who's not Latino, because actually choosing to publish her, I remember raised a few eyebrows. And in fact, I remember asking someone for a blurb and that person declining to blurb Lisa because
She wasn't a real Latina. Yeah, I wanted to start thinking of those controversies and those interpersonal conflicts because they make such good stories. Then the more time goes by, the more good work you do, haters be hating. The more there is occasion to talk about what should have happened or what didn't happen, and so many people like to have an opinion about something they're not involved in. But would you say this was the first sort of Momotombo controversy, or the first time you encountered a less than pleasant experience as a publisher in that dialogue about being criticized for having published a Portuguese writer? Was that the first time you felt like, oh, it's getting a little lonely at the top?
I think, yeah,
Uh-huh.
I think you're right. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I would say, yeah. It wasn't. It just made me aware. It made me aware, in some ways, that the publication of that chapbook was a fork in the road in terms of the publishing philosophy, and also the whole debate about Latinidad as well.
Yeah.
Is it? Are we? I'm going to go down. What do I believe? Do I err on the side of inclusion
Right.
or err on the side of exclusion?
And so
That was my. That was when I just I err on the side of
Y
inclusion.
that was you standing on the side of inclusion, and in fact, your early experience being published in a chapbook series reflected that inclusion as well, because it was the Chicano chapbook series, which may or may not be an inclusive sort of Pan-American identity.
I remember, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that we did at some point, I don't remember when, it might have been in 2006 when we were well into our trajectory. We did an interview. I did an online interview with Gary Soto
Mm.
to talk about the history of the Chicano chapbook series in more detail. And I remember specifically asking him, so Gary, why did you publish me? Because as I'm not Chicano.
Uh-huh.
And his response was, he used an interesting term. He said, oh, but you're raza. You're raza,
Yeah.
you grew up in the Mission District.
And that was his inclusive conception. Yeah, you grew up in the Mission, and
Yeah.
yeah, much like Lisa's self-conception. I grew up in California in these Latino communities, and
Yeah.
or at least with Latino peers. All right, so here's a material question. So here's a flyleaf. This is a nice gold flyleaf. And here's a blue one. Who made all of those decisions and what were your
I think,
all of the
yeah,
fine
no,
tune?
design decisions, I would set general parameters. Like I
Uh-huh.
knew I wanted a flyleaf, and wanting a flyleaf
Speaking
goes
of.
back to our experience with Swanside Press.
Uh,
And then I would just tell the designer that I want a flyleaf, and the designer would then
would
pick the
oh,
colors and
yeah.
run things by me. But
Oh.
primarily, I just knew that I wanted a flyleaf because I just thought flyleaves are nice.
So this is Charles as your designer,
Mm-hmm.
and this one's also Charles?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Should we
Yes.
move on to Brenda, or do you
Yeah.
want to talk about Momotombito in the meantime?
Let's move on to
Move
Brenda.
on to Brenda. Is this your first Midwestern writer? That might be the first
I'm
one.
trying
Although Lisa lived in the Midwest when hers came out, but she's a Californian.
to remember how I. Do you remember? Because you
How you
edited
met Brenda? I
Brenda.
did. This was
I'm
one
trying
I
to remember
edited.
why Brenda even.
How you first met her?
I think no. I think what happened with Brenda. Here's what happened with
Uh
Brenda.
huh.
I'm remembering it now. Let me just see the year. The one thing to perhaps mention to talk about context. Yeah. So in the summer of 2004, I was putting together the proposal for the wind shifts, and I remember
In
that
the
I
summer of
needed
2004. Okay.
some Latinas from the Midwest.
Oh, okay.
And I discovered Brenda Cardenas's edited volume. I forget what it's called. It
Uh
was
huh.
published by Carlos Cumpian's
Yeah.
Marcha Brazo
And she
Press.
was living in
She
Chicago
was
at
living in
the
Chicago. It
time.
was
Yeah.
co-edited by her and Johanny Vasquez Paz.
That's right.
And from that anthology, I plucked Brenda, Vanessa Fuentes, who lives out in
Uh huh.
Minneapolis. And then I contacted Brenda to get work from her
Mm.
for The Wind
Mm-hmm.
Shifts. And it was that experience of reading her work for The Wind Shifts that made me think I want to do a chapbook of her work.
Uh huh.
That's how,
Lovely.
that's how Brenda became a Momotombo. So her book came out in 2005. Yeah.
And The Wind Shifts eventually came out in 2009.
Seven.
Seven. Oh,
Seven.
okay. That was the University of Arizona Press anthology
Yeah.
that you edited of
How, do
Latino.
you remember how you came to be the editor of this volume?
I think that you just were at a time where your roles were expanding through Letras Latinas here, and you thought it might be nice to have some help, to have a right-hand gal, I think, was that your plate was getting very full, as I recall. And I was in South Bend by then, I think is the other significant note. By then, I had ended up in South Bend as well, to my delight,
So
working
what
right
year did you
across
get
the street from.
what year did you get to South Bend?
2003, I became a
Okay.
faculty fellow with the Center for Women's Intercultural Leadership across the street at St. Mary's. You were already here at Notre Dame, and so that was a nice chance to reconnect. And
What do you remember about editing Brenda's manuscript?
we spent a lot of time on the phone. I remember we spent a lot
Really?
of time on the phone, and I was probably a little saucier then. I think she had sent a book length. She had sent me at least one book length manuscript from which I could pull different poems, and some of the poems I pulled didn't include some that she had been reading for years and years that had gone over well with live audiences. And sometimes we would have to agree to disagree on what should be in there, but more often than not, she was amenable to some of my suggestions. I was very hands-on. I had a lot of changes that I had suggested to her, and a lot of reordering, and a lot of questions for her about how did this work and why did this work. And I think I brought, of course, my own preferences to the work too. The first one here, Medicine, I think she never thought of that as a poem that might open the book, but to me it's so heavy on mythology and, of course, very lush natural imagery, which I
Mhm.
love, that I advocated it for the first one, and she agreed. So it was a very dynamic process, and I definitely did not hold back in terms of my ideas, and for the most part, she was very receptive, and when she wasn't, she was comfortable saying that too. She was comfortable expressing her horror about some of my
Well,
ideas.
I remember during that because sometimes we would email,
Yes, and
and
we
I
would
think
debrief.
one of the things I remember was that she would have a poem, for example, that Juan Felipe Herrera liked a lot,
And
and that would be her reason for wanting to include it, or
right.
and then you didn't
I would say
necessarily.
something cheeky to you. Juan Felipe Herrera is not your editor. That was just us debriefing. I never said that to her face, but sorry, Brenda.
How did we decide to include these woodcuts by what's his name? Is it
That was a friend of hers. I think she had been kind of,
Jeff Abbey Maldonado linocuts
yeah, she, I think, had been involved with some of the galleries in Chicago, in particular Mexican Fine Arts
in
Museum. Yeah.
Pilsen?
Yeah, in Pilsen. I think she had been involved with some of the arts scene, the Chicano arts scene, and wanted to include those. That was her idea.
And I suppose we should say that this From the Tongues of Brick and Stone was introduced by Maurice Kilwin Guevara and blurred by Demetria Martinez and Juan Felipe. I think this is a good moment to also begin to talk about, because I think this title and the next two, meaning these two, were probably the titles. We'll say what they were. Tongues from the Brick and Stone,
Poetry,
Malinche's Daughter
nonfiction,
by Michelle Otero with an introduction by Lisa D. Chavez, and Pepper Spray
back to poetry.
by Paul Martinez Pompa and introduced by Luis Rodriguez. These three titles were probably the three titles that were most adopted in classrooms.
Oh, okay.
And they sold. I
uh-huh.
kept getting
Brenda
that.
sold out.
Brenda's sold out, but
Uh-huh.
it sold out because it was getting adopted. It was getting adopted.
And that's from a run of 300?
No, these were 500 now.
Uh-huh.
Actually, no, let me yeah, Brenda. Yeah, this was 500.
Uh-huh.
This was
Uh-huh.
500. And they were selling so well. This was 1,000.
No
And this
kidding.
one actually went into a second printing
Huh.
because it was selling so well.
Yeah.
And
That's
Paul's was 500 and it sold out. And it was so I found myself oftentimes filling out book orders. And I began to realize that I probably needed more help because I
Uh-huh.
found myself a lot of my time was spent filling
Yeah.
out book orders. And the nice thing about Michelle Otero's collection of nonfiction, it sold and she was really good about pushing it.
Mhm.
She gave tons of readings, and she was actually able to get her Harvard classmates to bankroll the second printing.
Mm.
And suppose we should also say, I should say, that Michelle Otero's collection, her work, was brought to my attention by Richard Yanez.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Who had been at St. Mary's across the street from 2000 until 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Paul's work, like Brenda's work, came to my attention because of the work I was carrying out for the Institute. In this case, specifically, the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize. Paul's submitted a full-length manuscript to the first edition of the prize, and that's how I first became acquainted with his work.
Oh, okay.
And so the first edition of the prize was in 2004.
Uh-huh.
The book came out in 2005. And so he immediately became a candidate not only for the Wind Shifts, but also for the press.
Oh.
And I would say that
And he's in Chicago.
and he's in Chicago as well. And I would put Kevin A. Gonzalez in the same category.
Mhm.
Kevin A. Gonzalez also submitted a full-length manuscript to the first edition of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize.
Oh, okay.
So that made him a candidate for the Wind Shifts and also Momotombo Press.
Okay. In particular, after they didn't necessarily win that competition,
Exactly.
but then they still had this unpublished manuscript that you had significant interest in.
Yeah.
Are these all the same designer, Charles?
These are all Charles.
Okay.
These are all Charles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this one. This one strikes me as harkening back to those chapbooks from the 60s.
I think what we were trying to go for there was to
Playbill.
a playbill
Yeah.
of a boxing
Yeah.
match.
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
Yeah. And this one, of course, was introduced by Terrence Hayes
Uh-huh.
and blurred by Jim Daniels, and Paul's chapbook was introduced by Luis Rodriguez.
That's right. That's right. Wow, that's a lot of work. And yet you kept going.
I suppose I could say something about Momotombito before
Yeah, we get
before
to the
wind
closing
down.
act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One time I was wandering through the stacks here at Hesburgh Library.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I was wandering through the stacks of Hesburgh Library, and I came across a little chapbook that was published by Robert Half. In fact, I include that here.
I don't think I remember hearing about that. Oh, yeah, that Bob.
I said, so okay, let me just see if I can say this. I'll just say it.
Yeah.
When John Matthias expressed interest in publishing something with Momotombito, an informal imprint of Momotombo Press, I couldn't help but feel honored. Unbeknownst to him at the time, his two poems, an 8-page chapbook printed in England in 1997, which I discovered in the stacks of Hesburgh Library, had, with its simple gray cover, served as a model for the design of In Praise of Cities, the inaugural volume of this imprint. One of his two poems is dedicated to Bob Hass, the Bay Area-based writer who, as it happens, was the first contemporary poet I read as a senior in high school in San Francisco.
Huh.
And so that experience that experience made me think that I could create this space, Momotombito, two kinds of gestures. One is to publish something by someone who doesn't mind paying the bills,
Mhm.
but who wants something, but who does not want to outright so it's a form of
Mhm.
self-publishing because
Mhm.
you're paying the bills,
Mhm.
but within this creative
Within
space.
an imprint that
Yeah,
you.
which was what this was.
Oh, that's the
And
John Matthias book,
yeah,
okay.
but I not but the second gesture was for those people who had no qualms about paying the bill even for themselves.
Uh-huh.
So In Praise of Cities was a gesture that I did on the heels of 9/11.
Mm.
There are three poems. One is a newer poem about 9/11,
Mhm.
and I decided to foot the bill myself.
Mhm.
And again, I was being inspired by the things that we've talked about before:
Mhm.
small press publishing, Pepper Canister Press. So I created this, and then once I created this, I remember giving a copy of it to John Matthias and him
Mhm.
really liking it. And then he's the one who approached me about doing this,
Mm.
and I had to reiterate to him, but you have to pay for it. He said, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine."
And you knew him already through.
John Matthias was my first poetry teacher here at
Mm.
Notre Dame.
Okay.
And I think I mentioned the Bob Hass connection because Bob Hass, Robert Pinsky, James McMichael, and John Peck cohorts at Stanford in the late
Hmm.
60s, and they all studied together under
Wow.
Ivor Winters.
Huh.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah.
Interesting.
And like anything, one of the things that you'll see that in the back of the first one I write here, it just goes to show that sometimes you have projects in mind that don't come to pass.
Yeah.
I have here In Praise of Cities, his inaugural chapbook of Momotombito. And then I have a little paragraph here that says Chicano writer Richard Yanez is the next author slated for publication.
Oh,
Momotombito series, his first
yes.
collection of stories, El Paso del Norte, will be published in 2003. So we were going to do a Momotombito chapbook with Richard Yanez, and I don't remember what happened.
Let's do the we were gonna do's. The
Exactly.
ghost
This is a good
that
time to.
you don't see. The we were gonna do's.
We
Yeah.
have two of them.
We have 3 if you include Rich's that we
Okay,
don't
that's
even
right.
remember what
Yeah.
the heck
Well, Rich is going to
happened.
be Momotombito, but
Right.
let's talk about the first.
Because during this period, you bring me on as associate editor. These other books come out. I'm still associate editor, but no one would know it because no books come out that I've actually edited.
So how did we? We're talking about Gabe Gomez, right?
Yes, so Gabe Gomez, whose book The Outer Bands won the Montoya
The
Prize
second
in
Montoya
the
Prize.
second Montoya Prize in 2011.
The prize would have been held. It would have. No, he would have won it in 2006. The book would have came out in 2007.
Oh, I was way
Yeah.
off. 2007.
But how did
And
we meet Gabe?
he had blind submitted. We had some kind of call somewhere. I don't know. We had a call for submissions somehow, somewhere, and you had a kind of a stack of submissions from folks you didn't know.
I think I know it.
Okay,
It may
good.
have been
Good, because I don't.
in your condition as associate editor. I gave you a small
Yes,
stack of manuscripts,
that
and
you had been.
I said choose one.
Yeah,
And
that
you
you
were
had
gonna
been.
I think you were gonna exercise your associate editorship
Right.
by choosing one, and
Yeah,
you picked
I
Gabe
did. I
Gomez.
picked Gabe Gomez. I did. But where did you get that stack? Just from your travels around the country talking about Momotombo and people would pass them to you?
It may it,
None of us knew him
no,
before.
it may have been him just blind submitting.
I think it was him blind submitting because
Yeah.
by then you have at least some or all of these books. So it was gaining some visibility in the poetry world. And you had the Latino Mission. There weren't any other chapbook publishers that had a Latino Mission at the time. So Gabe Gomez, he is ethnically Mexican American.
Yeah, from El Paso.
From Texas, that's right. And his poetics is more on the non-narrative experimental side. And I selected his manuscript and called him up, and Katrina had just happened maybe 2 weeks before, and I saw this New Orleans address and phone number. Luckily, it was a cell phone. It was still working. I called him up and I said, "This is Maria from Omotombo Press." "Yes." "First of all, are you okay?" "Yes." And in fact, they had lost everything, but they themselves had evacuated and were safe. But
Hmm.
he and his wife, and so then I said, we'd like to publish your book." And of course, he said, "This is the best news I've had all month." So I selected some poems, and then we spent a lot of time on the phone, as well as I had with Brenda, with me being very hands-on and him also being very willing to just dive back in and revise. I really have to credit the willingness of these poets to re-examine work that they may have spent so much time with already through readings and through submissions to magazines. We had a very hands-on process, created a chapbook,
Do you remember?
created an order.
Did we have a title?
I don't know. It may have been called The Outer Bands. I don't remember because it had some Katrina-focused poems, and The Outer Bands
Hmm.
refers to the outer bounds of our hurricane. So maybe it was called The Outer Bounds. I don't remember. But we had the whole thing. We had the order. We had all the revisions sewn up and tied with a bow.
And then concurrently, the second edition of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize was underway. Valerie Martinez was the final judge. I would have culled 20 finalist manuscripts and sent them to her. And we were getting around the time where she was going to have to announce who the winner was. And the interesting thing about it is that when she finally communicated to me that the winner, personally, she communicated to me that the winner was Gabriel Gomez, I was slated to go to the Border Book Festival in a couple of weeks. And she was in New Mexico, and I pitched the idea to her, what if we make the official announcement of the winner of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize at the Border Book Festival? There was going to be a session there with Emmy Perez, and I was going to be...
So that would have been the summer?
Spring. We're
Spring of
talking...
2007.
The book came out in 2007. This would have
Spring
been
of 2006.
spring of
Okay.
2006.
Okay.
And so here's what we did. But we wanted to let Gabe know, right? So we wanted to have an official announcement of the prize, but we wanted Gabe obviously to know. So I have Gabe's cell phone number. We're in the parking lot. We're walking to the session where we're going to make the announcement. And we call up Gabe on the cell phone. And I give the cell phone to Valerie Martinez. And Valerie Martinez lets Gabe know that he's the winner.
Wow.
And then we go to the session, and Valerie reads her statement, which eventually became the introduction to the book.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And so I guess at that point, I'm not sure when we began to think, oh God, now what do we do about the Momotoma
I think
Press?
it was a little awkward because I think the concern was that it would just seem...
They'd be competing with one another. And
Yeah,
obviously,
they would compete with one another, and one might wonder, have you become the Gabe Gomez Society? You brought out his chapbook, you brought
And I
out his
think-
book.
I think I don't know we can't do both. In other words, you won the
It
prize.
just didn't seem, it didn't, they would be competing, they would be parallel gestures, and most of the books in the chapbook were in the book manuscript, so they went on to have a life of their own in his book, The Outer Bands. So now, do you have any graduate student help at this point before we go to the final titles? Did you have students working for you, or
No.
no,
No.
just...
At that point, you were still the acquiring editor. Rich was an acquiring editor in
That's
some
right.
ways because
That's right. He helped with...
and he had a project that he was trying to work on, which never came to fruition. I don't even remember. It might have been a former student of his.
It was a former student. I remember that. That was another we didn't do.
Yeah.
Yes, because she kept revising and revising, and
it never went anywhere.
nothing ever happened. We never got
Yeah.
the final manuscript.
Yeah.
She may still be revising it to this day. But
And
he added to this one, Malinche's daughter.
And I should say that we do have one exception here, in a sense that the mission of Momotoma Press was to publish emerging voices, new voices in Latino literature in the chapbook format. We broke that mold for one title, and that was Braille for the Heart by Robert Vasquez, introduced by Diana Marie Delgado. Here we have the idea of the mentee introducing the mentor, poetically speaking.
Nice variation.
And blurbed by another mentee, Eduardo Corral. So Eduardo and Diana both were big admirers of Robert's work. And this was actually an example of an experiment that didn't really bear the fruit that I'd hoped it would. And Robert consented to having a chapbook of his work published, and the objective was going to be that this was going to be a limited edition chapbook to raise money. And I think we printed, I think, like 3 of them. And the idea was that we were going to sell all 300 for $30 and make whatever that math is. And it just didn't quite get off the ground.
Yeah, it was a limited edition that was published as a fundraiser. I remember that, and it didn't... Nothing ever slowed you down, though. You never said, you know what, this didn't work, and I'm just so discouraged, so hang it all. Anyway, what do you think that was in you, that just, if there was a roadblock, you just would make a slight change in course and keep moving?
By that time, certainly the fact that this was a fundraiser meant that I was in full swing here at my job at Letras Latinas at Notre Dame, and that I had to raise money. It was part of my...
That was part of your job, your mandate.
It was part of my job description.
So if something didn't work, trying the next thing was a natural part of your professional station here, basically.
Yeah. And the last 2 titles, before we talk about the final title that wasn't, because that was going to be the final
title that wasn't, that's right.
Yeah. So Scott and Guito...
back to California.
Scott and Guito was a really interesting relationship in that I was a student here, a graduate student at Notre Dame, and he was applying to MFA programs, including Notre Dame, and he got accepted, and he actually came for a campus visit. But in the end, He ended up going to Iowa,
Mhm.
but he had done his undergraduate degree at San Francisco State, where he studied with D.A. Powell.
Mm.
And he was, along with Rosa Alcala, was one of the two poets who I felt were the more experimental poets of the Wind Shifts. And I knew that he had this series called Dear Jack. And I think over time, I decided that I wanted to try to publish a more experimental title. And I approached him about doing a collection. And we had Craig Santos Perez, who's from Guam, do the introduction, and D.A. Powell
Ah,
did the blurb.
so this ends up being the first title that's more firmly in that experimental tradition. It might have been
Yeah,
Gabe's, but it
yeah,
ends up being Scott's. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right. That's
yeah.
right. And you say, yeah, so now let's think about a sort of breadth and depth. So you said, I wanted to publish a more experimental title. So you wanted a kind of a breadth in aesthetics. At some point, we had the gender balance conversation. And that was what led us to our final title that wasn't, because I think we both
Talk,
agreed that it was
yeah.
time to try and reset the
Which
numbers.
is interesting because one of the things that I noticed about the Chicano chapbook series was how unbalanced it was,
Mm.
predominantly male, and
Mhm.
maybe like Sandra Cisneros and maybe two other
Mhm.
people. And this one, not to the same degree, but I began to notice that
It was
it
listing.
to one side. And so at some point we were talking about publishing Pat Mora's daughter. What's her name?
Oh, yes, Libby.
Libby.
Uh-huh.
That was another
Libby is
book we were talking
That's
about.
right, we were talking about Libby
Yeah.
Martinez, that's right.
And
Yeah.
then I guess this is part of Momotombo's history. When you went to the Latino Writers Conference in New Mexico.
That's right.
That's right. We had a chat panel
We had a
that,
chapbook
that you were
panel,
on.
yes. By then, I had managed to bring another book to print, I
And
had
at the
edited
time
this
we didn't
one.
know this was going to be our final title.
Yes, I
We
had just finished editing this one had just come out, so I think I had this one to promote at the conference and was sharing it around
and that's Octavio R. Gonzalez.
from New York City.
And he's a writer that had was put on my radar by Rigoberto Gonzalez.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things I will say about is that he was very good about sending me emails every now and then just to keep me abreast of what was going on in his writing life.
Uh-huh.
And he would do it like once or twice a year
Uh-huh.
for a few years.
Yeah.
And I eventually thought, okay, it's time. Let's
Uh-huh.
see. We need to do a chapbook by
Good.
him.
Yeah.
And then I asked you if you would look at
And
his
I
work.
loved editing his book. I thought it was really fun to work on that book.
And Rigoberto wrote a nice introduction.
Yeah, he did. Now I'm wondering too, before we get to the last one that wasn't, thinking about the idea of balance, and we had a gender balance, and then you wanted to have aesthetic diversity, and you have gay poets and you have straight poets. I wonder if we have religious diversity. I'm not
I don't
sure.
know.
We have straight women, and we had a lesbian poet scheduled for the end, Kathy Arellano.
You met her at
And
the
I met her at the National Hispanic
National Latino Writers Conference
oh, okay, at the
at the
Hispanic
National Hispanic Cultural Center
Cultural Center
in
in
Albuquerque.
Albuquerque, that's right, and I
And
had
the
a
context was that because you were there for a panel.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they set me up with little 20-minute consult slots, and so anyone could sign up to have a consult with the acquiring editor from Momotomo Press, which was a kick because it was just me. And so she brought her manuscript, and of the ones that I saw there, I was most impressed with hers, and I was also touched by her sense of place, her place rootedness. She grew up in the Mission, and a lot of her poems were about having lived through the first wave, maybe of gentrification in the
Hmm.
Mission, where
Yeah.
established families couldn't afford their renting longer or were getting evicted because their units were getting converted to upscale condos. And you grew up in the Mission, so I thought, oh, I bet Francisco will be pleased that we have a writer who's really emphasizing this cultural
Yeah.
history of the Mission. So I really liked that sense of place that she had, and being from the San Francisco Bay Area
And
myself.
so you worked with her, right?
Yeah, I said, let's do this book together. Now, did we use contracts at any point? I don't think
We did not because we just never got around
we
to
just
that
never got around
level
to
of formality.
formalizing it.
We never got to that level of formality.
Right.
And up until that moment, that had never caused a
Ye
problem. In hindsight, it perhaps could have avoided some things,
yeah.
but it was always, just to use a sexist term, a gentleman's agreement.
A smile and a handshake would get you a chapbook. Yeah, and so I'm smiling about it now because the whole thing fell apart at some point or another, but we got as far as having created 2 chapters.
Hmm.
We created one together where I suggested selections and she suggested modifications, and we had started editing. We had been through one pass of edits, and she withdrew that whole thing and said, I've completely reconceived my work. I really want to, instead of option A, I want to do option B that has distinct thematic emphases. Will you please look at this instead? So then I got a new batch of poetry and looked at that new batch, and we worked together to create the conception of a chapbook for option B.
Mhm.
And Shuri Moraga was set to write the introduction.
And I think she wrote it.
I don't think we ever had quite gotten it from her. I don't think she ever wrote it. I never saw it if she wrote
I
it.
think I'm gonna have to check.
Yeah. There
So,
may not have it had an introducer, if not an introduction.
yeah, I think she wrote it because I do know we eventually got a cover. It was an image of a photograph that she took
Yes.
of
The cover was designed,
Mission
the
High
selections
School.
were made, the
I also
last edits were in the
I
process.
also remember, and this is one of the things that, as we wind down, I do remember the experience of choosing the cover,
Mhm,
and there was a lot of back and forth, and I had to let her know that this is that this part of the process is the
mhm,
publisher's domain
mhm,
because she was suggesting many different covers.
mhm,
But we ended up having a really beautiful cover of Mission High School,
mhm.
and by that time, the designer was a guy named Chris Shackman.
Yes. Which was his first title? This one,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
No. You know what? I just realized something, and I'm glad I remembered right now. We're actually missing a title.
Oh.
Yeah. Aaron Morales. Aaron Morales, the fiction writer.
Oh gosh, which also sold out, didn't it?
No.
No, it didn't sell out.
There was high hopes for it selling
Oh,
out.
okay,
But
okay.
anyway, it was Aaron Morales who brought us on to the last designer.
Oh, okay,
But we
yes.
should say that, yeah, Aaron
Chris
Morales.
Shackman's
Yeah, yeah,
first book with
yeah,
Momotombo.
yeah. But Aaron Morales wrote a fiction chapter, which was actually an excerpt from his novel,
That's right.
Drowning in Tucson,
That's
I
right.
believe, which was
Yep.
published by Coffee House Press. And it was
Okay.
a beautiful chapbook.
Yes.
For some reason, I didn't find a copy of it, although I do have copies in my office in
That's right.
DC.
So that was two fictions, one nonfiction, and the rest poetry.
That was close.
One memoir basically is
Yeah, yeah.
Michelle's memoir.
So we had this beautiful
We were
cover.
close.
Yeah, we had this beautiful cover of Mission High School.
Yes, we had a
And
cover.
I think what happened was, and this gets back to the contractual issue.
Before we get let's delay the let's delay the mystery one more moment and say by now we knew this would be the last one.
That's right. That's right.
We
We were gonna,
knew time had come. All things had their season. This had a
and it seemed like a nice place to end, given that it was going to be about the Mission
and would it
District.
have been the 10th title in the
That
Latino mission? I think perhaps.
that I don't remember.
Yeah,
We can
I could count
actually
them up.
let's see. 1, 2, 3,
I
4,
don't remember how
5,
many.
6, 7, 8,
None and Aaron.
9, Aaron, 10. So it would have been 11.
It would have been 11?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So maybe we weren't counting Robert Vasquez because I had
possibly,
it in my head. Of
possibly.
course, he's Chicano, but his was a special edition for
That's true.
fundraising.
So it would have been our
It
10th
would have been our 10th
of the
of
mission.
regular standard Momotomo Publishing. It was gonna work to recant the or reset the not recant, but reset the gender balance. It was gonna be someone with ties to your
Do you remember the
hometown.
title?
Probably our first lesbian writer.
What title did we give
I
it?
don't remember because it changed a couple times. I was really excited about the work, and it had alternating prose and poetry, which was
That's
also
right.
a
It
nice
was multi-genre.
yeah, multi-genre, a nice turn
Before we
for the
close
press, for
out, I should
something
say
new.
that Aaron Morales' chapbook was From Here You Can See the End of the Desert.
That's right.
And it had a beautiful introduction by Luis Alberto Urrea.
Yes, that was
Yeah,
a really nice
yeah.
introduction. Yeah. So there we have Kathy's cover. We have her introducer selected. We have a selection. We're in the last round of edits. And what would you describe happened next?
I think what happened was, no, not what I think. So she sent me what she felt was a version of an agreement, a contract for
Hmm.
whatever it's worth.
Hmm.
And there were certain things that she wanted.
That she had generated
Yeah,
this
it was,
document.
yeah.
Okay.
And I basically went point by point and accepted some things, even improved some things, and
In
categorically,
her favor.
yeah,
Hmm.
and in other cases said, No, this is not the domain of the author, this is the
Hmm.
domain of the publisher."
Hmm.
And in essence, I sent the revised contract back to her,
Hmm.
which in my view improved the conditions,
Hmm.
but she withdrew.
That's right.
She withdrew.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Rather than continue negotiations.
yeah,
And then we said, should we try to replace it? Should we talked about Libby Martinez, who is a good writer. She
yeah.
lives in Colorado Springs. I live in Pueblo. She's Pat Moore's daughter, but she has her own identity as a writer. And then we sort of realized we're tired. Is that an accurate sort of description?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a brighter note you can put on it.
No, I think I just felt at that point that the publishing bug had run its course.
Uh-huh.
Because even by then, my role was publisher, not editor.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I was paying the bills,
Yeah.
and other people were doing the
And you
editing.
had a good, solid, at least dozen other projects going by then.
Probably.
Yeah, if not 2 dozens.
Yeah.
And I, by then, was editing a periodical. I was editing Pilgrimage magazine that came out 3 times a year. We were both stretched pretty thin, probably. Time.
Yeah, and I think I felt projects of this nature have their natural life
That's right.
cycle.
That's right. Just like kind of chapbook series. Didn't last forever, but was
Yeah.
impactful while it was here.
And one of the most gratifying things about a lot of the writers that we published, because the mission was to publish writers who did not yet have a full-length book. That's
Right.
important to remember. I don't
As
think
a
we mentioned that.
as a boost
Yeah.
to them.
That was it was that the niche was very specific. Writers who did not yet publish a full-length book.
Def
So we forgot to mention that Paul Martinez Pompa went on to win
Mhm.
Montoya Poetry
That's right.
Prize.
The next time he entered.
Brenda Cardenas went on to publish her first book, Boomerang, with Bilingual Press,
Mhm.
the Canto Cosa series that I edit.
Which yeah.
Kevin A. Gonzalez went on to publish his first book with Carnegie Mellon
Mm.
Press. Steven Cordova went on to publish his first book with Bilingual Press, which was
Mhm.
also part of the Canto Mundo series. And where anyone else? I think that's it in terms of people who went on to publish.
I think so. Did
Aaron
yeah.
Michael Morales went on to publish his novel with Coffee House Press.
And me.
That's right.
I went on to publish with University of Arizona.
And Eric Goodis went on to win
Yes.
a first book prize in California,
That's right.
I believe.
That's right. So mission accomplished. Wouldn't you say?
I don't know. What do you think?
Not the firm answer I was expecting. Can I tell about our witness? We have our friend Blas Falconer here off camera. Our witness.
We had him here in
Sure.
case we got into any awkward silences. He was gonna
Didn't
he was
happen.
gonna lob some softball
Yes,
questions.
that's right. Did you have something that you thought we didn't cover?
I wrote several questions down and you answered them all. The last one I had, which I wasn't sure if you were going to answer, is what made you decide to end?
Wrap it up. Yeah.
I guess we were intending to end it with Kathy's chapbook.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, we decided we were gonna end it. It just turns out that it ended with Javi's instead.
So
Tavio.
takeaways, life lessons, deep insights. So one of them that I think we both came away from was distilled in this conversation you had with Tree Swenson. And Tree Swenson introduced a new term to you. Didn't she say something like, there's a difference between publishing and privishing?
Yes, yes.
Do you want to talk about some of your takeaways, some of your
Well,
life lessons?
It's her term, privishing. What happens when you privish, if I remember correctly, is that you actually produce the physical book, but then if you don't have an infrastructure in place to
Sits in your
disseminate
closet, yeah.
it sits in boxes. And I would say that it's been a mixed bag with Momotombo Press, and a
Mhm.
lot of it has had to do with how active the authors were
That's right.
in promoting their books.
That's right.
So there were cases of authors who promised to really push, and that promise fell short.
Uh-huh.
There were cases of authors who really went above and beyond, probably, and
Yeah.
I have no qualms about saying this, the person who went above and beyond. Brenda, but also Michelle Otero. Remember
And
her?
Michelle.
Her.
Mhm.
We did 2,
Yeah, that's pretty significant for a small press.
and she sold out both print runs. And
Okay.
Brenda and Paul did great in the sense that their books got adopted in class.
Uh-huh.
That was really
That was important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there were other authors who this is something that's perennial in poetry, that if the author doesn't get out there and push the book,
Yeah.
it can languish. Yeah.
That's true. That we just found that as a cold hard truth. And often I've heard graduate students have this nail biting anxiety of, oh, if I can't do the promotion thing or if I can't get into POBIZ, I'll never get anywhere. And fundamentally, it's dazzling work that gets advanced and that gets those wheels turning on a writer's visibility on the one hand. On the other hand, we ended up that we couldn't ignore whether we thought someone could promote a book or not. So that by these last 3 or 4 titles, we would have conversations during the acquisition phase. Do you think this person can give a reading? Do you think this person can go out and seek? Yeah, stir their own pot. And if yes, then that was taken into consideration.
Because we didn't have the resources.
Because we didn't have the resources, and not that this was taken into consideration after we had found work that we liked, after we found work that we were excited about.
Yeah.
Sometimes beginning poets worry that there's all this crappy work out there getting visibility just because someone knows how to do a Facebook post or something.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
not true. It's that there's so much good work competing with each other that the only sort of factor that can set one above the fray of many excellent contemporary titles is, are you willing to build an audience yourself? And we would have to have those explicit conversations by the end of it. Not at the beginning, I don't think. I think we just thought, let's give it a try with the early ones And you were very trusting of us, of the 5 of us. You early on said to the 5 of us in an email, in the Mark My Words, you said, "This is your book now, so I'm trusting you to promote it and get some readings." And so I think that bore fruit through the rest of the Momotombo. Anytime that did happen, those were the books that did well.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Publishing versus publishing.
I guess that's a wrap, isn't it?
That's a wrap.
Thank you for doing this.
This was fun.